The gavel didn't bang. It made a hollow, wooden clack, like a cheap door shutting forever. Cherish watched the ink dry on the settlement, signing away a decade of her life for a fraction of her worth. Across the mahogany table, Dallas let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. He leaned back, fixing his cuffs, a smirk reflecting off the polished wood. He thought he had gutted her. He didn't know the man in the back row was about to buy the courthouse. The courtroom smelled of floor wax and stale anxiety. It was a sterile, overly air-conditioned box on the 4th floor of the county courthouse, humming with the low, irritating frequency of failing fluorescent tubes. Cherish sat rigidly in her chair, the rough wool of her skirt scratching uncomfortably against her bare knees. She kept her eyes fixed on the grain of the defense table. There was a small gouge in the wood near her left thumb. She dug her nail into it, feeling the splintered edge. It was the only real, tangible thing in a room built entirely on legal fiction. "Is this agreeable to your client, Mr. Reynolds?" Judge Harrison's voice was dry, carrying the rasp of a man who had smoked 2 packs a day for 30 years. He sounded bored. To him, this was docket number 42. To Cherish, it was the execution of her adulthood. Reynolds, Cherish's appointed attorney, a man whose breath permanently smelled of synthetic peppermint and old coffee, leaned over. His cheap polyester suit rustled. "It's the best we're going to get, Cherish," he muttered, the whisper hot and damp against her ear. "He has the documentation. He has the board. You take the buyout, or you walk away with the debt." Cherish swallowed. Her throat felt coated in dust. She didn't look across the aisle. She didn't have to. She could feel Dallas. Dallas sat at the petitioner's table, flanked by 2 attorneys whose suits cost more than the car Cherish currently drove. He was perfectly still, exuding that practiced, terrifying calm he used in boardrooms. He was tapping his index finger against his thigh. Tap, tap, tap. A rhythmic, almost imperceptible sound. It was his tell. It meant he knew he was winning. "My client is prepared to sign, Your Honor," Reynolds said, standing up just enough to be respectful before dropping back into his chair. Cherish picked up the pen. It was a heavy, silver Mont Blanc, a gift Dallas had given her on their 3rd anniversary, back when they were still pretending the metal was cold. She stared at the signature line on page 47. Cherish Josephine Young. They were finalizing the division of assets, specifically the division of Oculus Dynamics, the software architecture firm they had started in a damp, mildew-scented basement flat 8 years ago. Back then, Dallas had been the visionary, the talker, the man who could sell ice to a blizzard. But Cherish had been the architect. She had spent thousands of hours staring at glowing monitors until her eyes bloodshot, writing the code that formed the spine of the company's flagship algorithm. But Dallas had been the one to file the LLC paperwork. Dallas had been the one to allocate the shares while Cherish was asleep at her keyboard. Dallas had systematically, quietly, and legally boxed her out of her own creation. And when he decided he no longer wanted a wife who looked tired, who smelled like burned coffee and code compilations instead of expensive perfume, he had struck. She pressed the nib to the paper. The ink bled slightly into the thick cotton fibers. Cherish. She wasn't crying. That was the strange thing. People expect weeping in a divorce. They expect screaming, thrown vases, mascara running down cheeks. Cherish just felt hollowed out, like a pumpkin scraped clean of its seeds. Her stomach roiled with a dull, persistent nausea, but her tear ducts were completely dry. Josephine. She thought of the apartment she was returning to. A cramped two-bedroom with a leaky radiator that clanked in the middle of the night. She thought of the 401k she was handing over, the stock options she was relinquishing. She was accepting a lump sum of $200,000. It sounded like a lot of money to someone who had nothing, but Oculus was valued at $40 million. She was selling her life's work for pennies on the dollar because Reynolds told her a protracted legal battle would drain her into bankruptcy within a month. Young. The pen lifted. It was done. A heavy silence settled over the room. Judge Harrison stamped a document, the mechanical thwack finalizing the severance. The court accepts the settlement. Decree of dissolution is entered. We are adjourned. Cherish didn't move immediately. She carefully capped the pen. Across the aisle, Dallas stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, a tailored navy brioni that draped perfectly over his shoulders. He leaned over the table, ostensibly to gather a folder, but his eyes caught hers. The smirk wasn't overt. It wasn't a cartoonish grin. It was a subtle, sharp lifting of the left corner of his mouth, a microscopic tightening of the muscles around his eyes. It was the look of a man who had gambled, cheated, and had the universe validate his methods. It said, "You were never in my league." Cherish's breath hitched, a sharp intake of oxygen that felt like swallowing glass. The nausea spiked. Her hands trembled slightly as she shoved the papers into her battered leather tote. She needed air. She needed to get out of this room before the smell of wax and mint suffocated her completely. The hallway outside courtroom 4B was a stark contrast to the quiet inside. It was a chaotic artery of the legal system, echoing with the clatter of heels on terrazzo flooring, the murmur of frantic conversations, and the occasional sharp sob from a bench against the wall. Cherish leaned against the cold plaster near the elevators. The marble beneath her cheap flats offered no warmth. She closed her eyes, letting the ambient noise wash over her, trying to steady the frantic beating of her heart against her ribs. She was 32, broke, and effectively unemployed, given that her non-compete clause, buried in the settlement she just signed, locked her out of the industry for 3 years. Cherish. The voice was smooth, pitched perfectly to sound reasonable and gentle to anyone passing by. It was the tone he used on investors when a project was delayed. She opened her eyes. Dallas was standing 3 feet away. Up close, the scent of his cologne, bergamot and cedar, a bespoke blend he bought in London, was overpowering. It smelled like the last 2 years of their marriage, expensive, sharp, and entirely artificial. "You don't need to gloat, Dallas," she said. Her voice was surprisingly steady, though it lacked any real volume. "The ink is dry. You have the company. You have the house in the hills. You can go back to whoever she is now." Dallas offered a small, patronizing sigh, slipping his hands into his pockets. "There's no one else, Cherish. I've told you that. This was simply business. You have to admit you weren't happy. You haven't been happy since the Series A funding. The pressure, the galas, the board meetings. It wasn't you. It wasn't me because you purposefully excluded me from every meeting, Dallas," she stated flatly. The anger was there, but it was buried under layers of exhaustion. "You took my name off the patent filing. You changed the security protocols on the server." "I streamlined the operation," he corrected smoothly. Investors don't want a married couple bickering over code architecture. They want a singular vision. I provided that. Cherish looked at his hands. They were manicured, clean. They had never known a blister or a paper cut. She remembered a night, 5 years ago. It was 3 a.m. The servers were crashing. The beta launch was in 12 hours, and she was drinking cold, bitter coffee out of a plastic cup, typing furiously while the fan of her overheating laptop burned the skin on her thighs. Dallas had been asleep on the couch, wrapped in the only good blanket they owned. When the code finally compiled, when the system stabilized, she had gently woken him up to tell him they did it. He had smiled, kissed her forehead, and said, "Good girl, now let me sleep." She hadn't recognized the condescension then. She thought it was affection. "You took everything," Cherish said, her voice dropping to a whisper. It wasn't an accusation, it was an inventory. Dallas's smirk returned, brief and cutting. "I took what I built. I gave you a generous severance. 200,000 is more than enough for you to figure things out, take a vacation, buy a smaller place, start over." He checked his watch, a platinum Patek Philippe. "I have a flight to catch. We're opening the new office in Seattle." He turned to walk away, his leather soles clicking sharply against the floor. Cherish watched his retreating back. The betrayal didn't feel like a knife in the chest. It felt like a slow, systemic poisoning. He had dismantled her life with the same detached precision she used to debug a broken script. She turned back to the elevator, pressing the down button. The metal was smudged with dozens of fingerprints. As she waited, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from an unknown number. "Proceed to courtroom 4D. Do not leave the building." Cherish frowned, staring at the cracked screen of her phone. Courtroom 4D? Her case was over. Reynolds had already scurried off to his next bargain bin defense. She typed back, "Who is this?" The bubble appeared immediately. "A friend. Go to 4D now." A spike of paranoia pierced her numbness. Was it Dallas? Some final legal trap? But Dallas was leaving. And Dallas didn't play cloak and dagger games. He preferred crushing people in broad daylight, on paper. She looked down the hall. 4D was at the far end, near the heavy oak doors of the probate and complex litigation wing. The hallway there was darker, the bulbs overhead buzzing with a deeper, more ominous hum. Cherish hesitated. Her legs felt like lead. She just wanted to go home, to strip off the itchy wool skirt, crawl into her unmade bed, and finally, hopefully, cry. But a strange, magnetic pull tugged at her tired muscles, a flicker of something that wasn't defeat. Curiosity, or maybe just the desperate hope that the script wasn't entirely written yet. She shoved the phone back into her pocket, gripped the strap of her tote, and walked toward the dark end of the hall. Courtroom 4D was massive. Unlike the sterile, modern box where her divorce had just been rubber-stamped, this room was a relic of the 1920s. Dark, heavy mahogany paneling covered the walls. The ceiling was vaulted, adorned with cracked plaster molding. It smelled intensely of lemon oil, old paper, and the faint metallic tang of an approaching storm from the open transom windows near the roof. Cherish slipped through the heavy double doors, letting them shut quietly behind her with a soft thud. The gallery was entirely empty, save for a single row of wooden benches that looked designed to punish anyone who sat on them. At the front, the well of the court was busy. It wasn't a standard trial. It looked like a high-level corporate dispute. Boxes of discovery were stacked high on the tables. And standing at the plaintiff's table, looking decidedly less smug and entirely more rigid, was Dallas. Cherish froze in the shadows of the back row. What was he doing here? He said he had a flight to Seattle. Next to him was not his slick divorce attorney, but a team of 3 older men in severe, bespoke suits, corporate litigators, sharks. At the bench sat a different judge, a woman with steel gray hair and an expression carved from granite, Judge Velez. Cherish recognized the name. Velez handled the district's most complex corporate bankruptcies and hostile takeovers. Mr. Mercer, Judge Velez said, her voice amplified by the cavernous acoustics of the room. It sounded like an accusation. You are standing before this court requesting an emergency injunction against a hostile acquisition of Oculus Dynamics. An acquisition that, according to the filings, was legally initiated 3 weeks ago. Cherish stopped breathing. Hostile acquisition? Oculus wasn't publicly traded. It was privately held by Dallas, with the board consisting of his hand-picked cronies. You couldn't just acquire it without his consent. Your Honor, Dallas's lead counsel spoke up, his voice lacking its usual booming confidence. The acquisition relies on a fraudulent transfer of debt. The shell company attempting this buyout, Apex Holdings, has illegally acquired my client's operational credit lines and called them in simultaneously. It is an extortion tactic designed to force bankruptcy. It is a legal calling of debts that your client defaulted on, Counselor, Judge Velez retorted sharply. He leveraged his company's IP to secure massive short-term loans. He gambled, he lost, and now the creditor is here to collect. Dallas's hands were flat on the table. The knuckles were white. The rhythmic tapping was gone. He looked visibly pale, a sheen of sweat gathering at his hairline. For the first time in years, Dallas looked terrified. They want the source code, Your Honor, Dallas interrupted, his voice cracking slightly. He ignored his lawyer's hand, reaching out to quiet him. They don't want the company. They want the algorithm. If they take the IP, Oculus is worthless. I built that company. Cherish felt a bitter, acidic bile rise in her throat at the lie. Be that as it may, Mr. Mercer, Velez said, adjusting her glasses. Apex Holdings has the paper. Unless you can produce $40 million by close of business today to satisfy the called debt, they assume controlling interest of the IP. That is the contract you signed. Dallas looked like he was going to be sick. The arrogant, untouchable man from 20 minutes ago was evaporating, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. Who even is Apex Holdings? He demanded, slamming a hand down. They're a ghost, a P.O. box in Delaware. Who is orchestrating this? The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom, the ones Cherish was standing mere feet from, suddenly groaned. The sound was agonizingly slow, the ancient brass hinges screaming in protest. The entire courtroom fell dead silent. Even Judge Velez looked up from her documents. Cherish pressed herself against the back wall, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and unhurried. A man stepped into the dimly lit aisle. He did not look like a billionaire corporate raider. He didn't wear a sharp Italian suit or sport a Patek Philippe watch. He wore a slightly worn, thick tweed jacket that smelled sharply of damp earth and old tobacco. His trousers were practical corduroy, and his boots were scuffed leather. He was in his late 60s, with a thick mane of silver-white hair and a face deeply lined by time and weather. But his eyes, piercing, icy blue beneath a heavy brow, carried the terrifying weight of a collapsing star. He didn't look at Dallas. He didn't look at the judge. He stopped at the end of the aisle, turning his head slightly to look at Cherish hiding in the shadows. Cherish felt the floor tilt beneath her. The air was sucked out of her lungs. The cheap wool of her skirt, the ache in her knees, the nausea, it all vanished, replaced by a paralyzing, icy shock. She hadn't seen that face in 14 years. Not since the day he walked out of their screen door in Ohio, leaving her and her mother with nothing but a stack of unpaid bills and a foreclosure notice. The man reached into his breast pocket, pulling out a pair of silver wire-rimmed glasses. He put them on, his gaze lingering on Cherish for a fraction of a second. There was no warmth in the look. There was only a grim, terrible acknowledgement. Then, he turned his attention to the front of the room. He began to walk down the center aisle. Every step echoed like a hammer strike. "My apologies for the delay, Your Honor," the man said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone that vibrated in Cherish's chest. It was a voice used to giving orders that were never questioned. Traffic out of the city was less than accommodating. Dallas stared at the old man, his brow furrowed in panicked confusion. "Who the hell are you?" The old man didn't look at Dallas. He walked past him, treating him with the same indifference one might give a stain on the carpet, and approached the railing before the judge's bench. "Adam Howard, Your Honor," the man said quietly, "managing director and sole proprietor of Apex Holdings." Dallas's lawyer scrambled through his files, frantically whispering to his junior associate. Dallas's face was a mask of pure terror. "Howard, the logistics guy? Why are you doing this? We operate in different sectors. I don't even know you." Adam finally turned. The movement was slow, predatory. He looked down at Dallas. The height difference wasn't much, but in that moment, Adam looked like a titan looking at an insect. "You don't know me, Mr. Mercer," Adam said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal murmur. "But you know my daughter." Dallas blinked, the confusion warring with the rising panic. "Daughter? What daughter? I don't—" Adam didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply pointed a weathered, calloused finger toward the back of the courtroom. "The one whose life's work you just tried to steal," Adam said, the syllables clipping the air like a blade. "Cherish." Every head in the courtroom swiveled to the back. Cherish stood frozen against the mahogany paneling. The silence in the room was absolute, so profound she could hear the blood rushing in her ears. Her hands gripped the leather straps of her cheap tote bag until her knuckles ached. Dallas's eyes locked onto hers, wide, horrified, and completely devoid of the smirk. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked from Cherish to the terrifying old man in the tweed jacket, and back again, the architecture of his entire reality crumbling in real time. Cherish stared at Adam Howard, the father who abandoned her, the billionaire who just bought her ex-husband's debt. The hollow numbness inside her finally shattered, and a terrifying, unnameable fire rushed in to take its place. Dallas's mouth opened and closed. He looked like a fish hauled onto a dry deck, his gills working uselessly against an alien atmosphere. The silence in the courtroom stretched, pulled taut like a wire about to snap. "Conflict of interest," Dallas finally choked out. He gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles bone white. He turned wildly to Judge Velez. "Your Honor, this is illegal. It's a coordinated attack. He pointed a trembling finger at Cherish. "She signed a binding settlement 20 minutes ago. This is retaliation." Judge Velez did not blink. She looked down at the stack of filings Adam's invisible legal machinery had submitted. "Mr. Mercer, the law does not care about your domestic disputes. Apex Holdings is a registered corporate entity. They purchased your commercial paper from 3 separate venture capital firms. Did you or did you not sign those promissory notes?" The collateral was the company, not immediate liquidation. "You missed 2 milestone payments, Dallas," Adam's voice cut through the room. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a dense physical weight. "Section 4, paragraph 12 of your mezzanine loan agreement. Default triggers an immediate acceleration clause. You put the IP up as collateral because you were arrogant enough to believe you'd never fail. You built a house of cards on my daughter's foundation." Dallas spun toward Adam, his tailored suit suddenly looking an entire size too big. The sweat on his forehead was catching the harsh overhead light. "I built Oculus. I secured the funding. I managed the scaling. She just wrote the back end." "She wrote the architecture," Adam corrected, stepping closer to the railing. "You were just the salesman. And you're a terrible salesman, Mr. Mercer, because you didn't read the fine print of the people you were selling to." Cherish remained pressed against the back wall. Her breath was shallow. She watched the man in the tweed jacket dismantle the man who had systematically ruined her self-worth. She should have felt vindicated. She should have felt a rush of euphoric triumph. Instead, her stomach cramped. Adam Howard. She stared at the slope of his shoulders, the thick silver hair. The last time she saw him, he was wearing a faded flannel shirt, tossing a duffel bag into the back of a rusted Ford Taurus. Her mother had been sobbing against the kitchen counter, the smell of burnt toast hanging in the air. He hadn't even looked back. Now, he was casually orchestrating a $40 million corporate execution. The dissonance was physically nauseating. Adam's lawyer, a quiet, severe-looking man who had materialized from the front row, handed a single sheet of paper to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. "Your Honor," the lawyer said, "proof of default and the formal execution of the asset seizure. We are taking possession of the Oculus Dynamic servers, physical assets, and all intellectual property, effective immediately." Dallas let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He looked at his own attorneys. The lead litigator, the shark who was supposed to protect him, was quietly packing his Mont Blanc pens into his leather briefcase. They knew when the blood was in the water. They knew when a check was going to bounce. "Wait," Dallas pleaded, his voice cracking entirely. He looked back at Cherish. The smirk was dead, buried under layers of sudden, catastrophic panic. Cherish, please, we can renegotiate the settlement. I'll give you 50%. I'll rip up the non-compete. Just call him off. Tell him to stop." Cherish's throat was dry. She looked at Dallas, the man who had spent the last year convincing her she was nothing more than a liability, a neurotically tired woman who couldn't handle the big leagues. Seeing him beg didn't heal the wound he had inflicted. It just made him look pathetic. "I don't know him, Dallas," Cherish said. Her voice was flat, echoing faintly off the mahogany panels. "I have no idea who that man is." Adam's posture stiffened infinitesimally at her words, but he didn't turn around. Judge Velez picked up her pen. The court recognizes the execution of the collateral seizure. Control of Oculus Dynamics and all related IP is hereby transferred to Apex Holdings. Mr. Mercer, you have until 5 p.m. to vacate the premises. We are adjourned. This time, the gavel did bang. It sounded like a gunshot. Dallas collapsed into his chair. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. The empire he had stolen, the millions he had hoarded, wiped out by a technicality and a ghost. Cherish didn't wait for the room to exhale. She turned, shoved the heavy oak door open with her shoulder, and bolted into the hallway. She needed to get out. The air in the courthouse was suffocating. She walked fast, her cheap flat slapping sharply against the terrazzo. She passed the elevators, heading straight for the emergency stairwell. She pushed through the fire door, the heavy metal slamming shut behind her, plunging her into the echoey concrete stairwell. She gripped the cold metal railing, leaning over it, taking deep, shuddering breaths. The smell of dust and floor wax filled her lungs. The door above her squeaked open. Cherish. She froze. The heavy measured footsteps began descending the concrete stairs. She didn't look up. She gripped the railing tighter, feeling the rust bite into her palms. Don't, she whispered. The footsteps stopped 2 steps above her landing. The scent of him arrived before he spoke. Sharp pipe tobacco, damp wool, and an underlying note of something metallic and cold. You're breathing too fast, Adam said. His voice in the enclosed concrete space was a physical pressure. 4 seconds in, hold for 4, exhale for 4, do it. The sheer audacity of the command snapped something inside her. Cherish spun around, her eyes blazing, the exhaustion suddenly burning away like fog under a blowtorch. Do not tell me how to breathe, she hissed, her voice vibrating with 14 years of buried rage. You do not get to walk in here after a decade and a half, by my ex-husband, and then tell me how to breathe. Adam stood perfectly still. He looked down at her. Up close, the lines on his face were deeper, etched like a map of a hostile territory. His icy blue eyes were unreadable. He didn't look apologetic. He looked evaluating. I didn't buy your ex-husband, Adam said calmly. I ruined him. There is a distinction. Why? The word ripped from Cherish's throat before she could stop it. It was a stupid question, a child's question, but it tasted like copper on her tongue. Mom died 3 years ago. The medical bills almost bankrupted me. Where were you then? Why are you here now? Adam pulled a silver pocket watch from his vest, glanced at it, and snapped it shut. The click echoed off the concrete walls. Your mother made it explicitly clear that my money was blood money. She refused the trusts I set up. She returned the checks. I respected her wishes. Cherish stared at him, her chest heaving. She was working 2 shifts at a diner, Adam. She died of a stroke because she couldn't afford her blood pressure medication. You're telling me you couldn't find a way to help? I offered, Adam said, his tone utterly devoid of defensive inflection. She threatened to involve the authorities if I sent another courier. Your mother was a proud woman, Cherish. Her pride was fatal. I cannot bend the laws of human stubbornness, no matter how much capital I possess. He stepped down to her level. He was taller than she remembered. Or maybe she had just shrunk. But I kept tabs, he continued, his eyes locking onto hers. I watched you build Oculus. I watched you write a predictive algorithm that is currently 5 years ahead of anything Silicon Valley is attempting. You are brilliant, Cherish. You have my mind. I am nothing like you, she spat, taking a step back until her shoulders hit the cinder block wall. You built an empire in a basement. You just let a parasite put his name on the deed, Adam countered smoothly. I stepped in because Mercer was in negotiations to sell Oculus to a defense contractor. They would have militarized your code, stripped the civilian applications, and fired you the moment the ink dried. He was going to sell your brain to the highest bidder to fund his lifestyle. Cherish's breath hitched. A defense contractor. Dallas had always sworn they would keep the tech open source, that they would use the predictive modeling for supply chain optimization and medical logistics. He had lied about that too. Of course he had. So you bought it, Cherish said, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. You saved the day. You're the billionaire savior. What do you want, Adam? A hug? Father of the Year award? Because I just signed away my life. I have $200,000 and a 3-year non-compete. I'm done. Adam reached inside his heavy tweed jacket. He pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope, the paper crisp and white. He held it out to her. Cherish looked at it, but didn't move her hands. What is that? The deed to the parasite's house, Adam said simply. Cherish blinked. Inside, Adam continued, are also the transfer documents for Apex Holdings' newest acquisition. I have zero interest in running a software firm. My business is heavy logistics, ships, trains, steel. Your code is elegant, but I don't have the patience to manage the egos in your industry. He pushed the envelope forward until it tapped against her chest. Instinctively, her hands came up to take it. It felt heavy. I am transferring 100% of the voting shares, the IP, and the physical assets of Oculus Dynamics to you, Adam said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. Free and clear of any debt. Mercer's non-compete is voided because the company he signed it for no longer exists in its previous iteration. Cherish stared down at the blank white envelope. Her hands began to tremble. The nausea was back, but it was mixed with a terrifying, dizzying adrenaline. You spent $40 million just to give it to me? I spent $40 million to ensure my daughter wasn't robbed in broad daylight by a man in a cheap suit, Adam corrected. Consider it 14 years of backlogged birthday presents. He turned away from her, grabbing the heavy metal handle of the stairwell door. Wait, Cherish said. Her voice cracked. The raw, messy contradictions inside her were violently colliding. She hated him. She hated his coldness, his absence, the fact that he could fix her life with a stroke of a pen while he let her mother die in poverty. But she was holding her life's work in her hands. He had given her the sword to slay the dragon that had just eaten her. Adam paused, looking back over his shoulder. You can't just drop this on me and leave again, Cherish said, her grip tightening on the envelope, crinkling the paper. Adam's expression softened, just a fraction. It was the ghost of a father's smile, buried under decades of corporate warfare. I'm not leaving, Cherish. I operate out of Chicago now. I expect you'll need new legal counsel to restructure the board. I can recommend several firms that won't sell you out. He opened the door. The chaotic noise of the courthouse hallway spilled into the quiet stairwell. Fix your company, fire Mercer's sycophants, and when you're ready to stop being angry at me, call. He stepped through the door, letting it swing shut. The heavy metal slammed against the frame, echoing up the concrete shaft, leaving Cherish alone in the dim light. She stood there for a long time. The smell of pipe tobacco slowly faded, replaced by the sterile scent of the courthouse. She looked down at the envelope. Her thumb traced the sharp edge of the paper. Dallas had told her she was a liability. Dallas had told her she couldn't handle the pressure. She opened the envelope, pulling out the thick stack of legal documents. There, on the front page, under the bold heading of Transfer of Ownership, was her name. Cherish Josephine Young. She wasn't a liability. She was the architect, and now she owned the building. Cherish took a deep breath. 4 seconds in, she held it for 4. She exhaled for 4. Then she pushed the stairwell door open and walked back out into the light. The drive up to the hills took 45 minutes, but to Cherish, it felt like a brief, dissociative blink. Her 10-year-old Honda Civic groaned as it climbed the steep incline of Mulholland Drive, the transmission slipping slightly on the hairpin turns. It was a stark contrast to the neighborhood. The air up here was thinner, quieter, insulated by high security hedges and the invisible barrier of obscene wealth. She pulled into the driveway of 4420 Oak Ridge Estate. The tires crunched loudly against the crushed white gravel, a specific, expensive gravel Dallas had imported because it didn't generate dust. Cherish killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy. Sitting in the passenger seat was the thick manila envelope Adam had shoved into her chest. It looked innocuous, just paper and ink, but it felt like a radioactive brick. She stared at it. She was the sole owner of a $40 million company and a house that looked like a modern art museum. She felt absolutely nothing like a millionaire. She just felt like she needed a shower. Cherish grabbed the envelope, pushed open her car door, and walked up to the front entrance. It was a massive slab of frosted glass and brushed steel. She reached out to punch in the keypad code, hesitating. Had he changed it? She typed in the sequence. 1104. Their wedding anniversary. The heavy lock clicked open with a satisfying mechanical clunk. Of course he hadn't changed it. Dallas was too lazy to memorize a new sequence and too arrogant to believe she would ever return. She pushed the door open. The immediate scent of the house hit her, a curated, synthetic blend of eucalyptus and white tea that pumped through the central HVAC. Dallas's interior designer had insisted on it. Cherish had always thought it smelled like an expensive dental clinic. The foyer was vast, echoing with the soft patter of her cheap flats against the polished concrete floor. To her left was the sunken living room. To her right, the floating glass staircase leading to the master suite. A sharp crash echoed from upstairs, followed by a muffled curse. Cherish froze, her hand tightening around the envelope. It was 4:15 p.m. The judge had given him until 5. She walked toward the stairs, her steps deliberately heavy. The glass steps didn't creak, but her shoes slapped against them, a warning siren. By the time she reached the second-floor landing, the frantic sounds of tearing fabric and slamming drawers were deafening. She stood in the doorway of the master bedroom. It was a disaster. The minimalist aesthetic Dallas curated so ruthlessly had been violently overthrown. Silk ties were pooled on the floor like dead snakes. Cashmere sweaters were thrown haphazardly onto the California king bed. Dallas was violently shoving a stack of bespoke dress shirts into a silver Rimowa suitcase. He was sweating, dark patches blooming under the arms of his wrinkled white button-down. He didn't look like a CEO. He looked like a man trying to outrun a fire. You're packing the hangers, Cherish said. Her voice was quiet, raspy, but it cut through the chaos like a knife. Dallas whirled around, knocking a crystal tumbler off the dresser. It shattered against the concrete floor, splashing amber liquid and ice cubes across the gray rug. The sharp smell of scotch instantly overpowered the eucalyptus. He stared at her, his chest heaving. His eyes were bloodshot, the panic from the courtroom now curdled into a cornered, frantic anger. "You set this up," he hissed, taking a step toward her. His shoe crunched on the broken glass. "You played the victim for months, letting me think I was winning, while you had a billionaire waiting in the wings to slaughter me." Cherish looked at him. She looked at the sweat on his upper lip, the trembling of his perfectly manicured hands. She searched her chest for the terror he used to inspire in her. It wasn't there. He just looked small. "I haven't spoken to my father since I was 18, Dallas," she said slowly, navigating the words as if speaking to a volatile drunk. "I didn't know he was coming. I didn't know he bought your debt. But I'm not going to apologize for the fact that you leveraged my company to fund a lifestyle you couldn't afford." "It was our company," he shouted, a vein popping in his neck. "No," Cherish corrected, her tone hardening. "You made very sure in court today that it was yours. You stripped my name off the patents. You boxed me out. You legally stated I was just an employee." She held up the envelope. "You drew the battle lines, Dallas. You just didn't realize you were outgunned." Dallas stared at the envelope. The fight seemed to drain out of him all at once, leaving a hollow, sagging shell. He ran a trembling hand through his meticulously styled hair, ruining it. He slumped against the edge of the bed. "Cherish," he whispered. The pivot was sickeningly fast. The anger vanished, replaced by the soft, pleading tone he used when he needed her to work through a weekend. "Cherish, please, I have nothing. The mezzanine loan was cross-collateralized with my personal accounts. That old man froze my liquid assets. My credit cards are declining. I can't even afford a hotel." He looked up at her, his eyes wide and wet. "We were married for 8 years. You know me. You know I just got carried away with the board's pressure. Please, give me 30 days to figure things out. Let me stay in the guest house." Cherish felt a sickening twist in her gut. It was pity, raw and unwanted. For a split second, the muscle memory of her marriage kicked in. The urge to accommodate, to soothe, to fix his messes. She looked at the floor, at the melting ice cubes dissolving into the expensive rug. Then she remembered the sound of his smirk in the courtroom. "I took what I built." "No," she said. The word tasted like ash, but it was firm. Dallas blinked, the wetness in his eyes drying up instantly. "No? You have 45 minutes before the asset protection firm my father hired shows up to change the locks," Cherish said, checking the cracked screen of her phone. "Take your clothes, take your watch, but leave the espresso machine. I paid for that with my first bonus." Dallas's jaw tightened. The mask slipped back into place, cold and hateful. "You're a vindictive bitch." Cherish turned around, stepping back into the hallway. "And you're trespassing. 44 minutes, Dallas." She walked back down the glass stairs. She didn't wait to hear him zip the suitcase. She went into the kitchen, a massive expanse of cold marble and stainless steel, and ran the tap. She splashed freezing water onto her face, letting it drip down her chin, soaking the collar of her cheap blouse. The house was hers. The company was hers. She leaned against the granite counter, gripping the edge until her fingers ached, waiting for the silence to return. The air in the Oculus Dynamics headquarters smelled like burnt espresso and localized panic. It was 8 a.m. on a Tuesday. The office was a sprawling, open-plan nightmare of glass partitions, exposed ductwork, and rows of standing desks, designed to look collaborative but actually functioning as a panopticon for management. Cherish stepped off the elevator on the 12th floor. She hadn't slept. She was wearing the same wool skirt from yesterday, though she had swapped the blouse for a thick, slightly oversized black sweater. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, messy knot. She clutched a lukewarm coffee from a bodega down the street. The hum of mechanical keyboards, usually a constant, deafening roar by this hour, was completely absent. The floor was dead silent. Dozens of heads popped up over their monitors as she walked through the glass double doors. The security turnstiles had been bypassed. Standing next to the reception desk was a massive man in a dark suit with a coiled earpiece, one of Adam's people. He gave Cherish a curt nod as she passed. She felt the weight of 80 pairs of eyes tracking her. They knew. In the tech world, blood in the water was detected via Slack channels within seconds. They knew Dallas had been liquidated. They knew the architect had returned. Cherish didn't look at them. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, marching down the center aisle toward the glass-walled executive suites at the back. Her stomach was doing slow, sickening rolls. She was an engineer. She preferred the cold, absolute logic of Python and C++. Dealing with human variables made her sweat. As she neared the corner office, Dallas's old office, the door swung open. Harrison Cole stepped out. He was the chief technology officer Dallas had hired 18 months ago to replace Cherish. Harrison was 28, wore sneakers that cost more than Cherish's car, and spoke entirely in corporate buzzwords. He was the one who had systematically locked Cherish out of the server infrastructure. "Cherish," Harrison said, forcing a broad white smile that didn't reach his panicked eyes. He stepped into her path, holding out his hands as if to slow a runaway train. "Wow, what a chaotic 24 hours, huh? The board is in a tailspin. But listen, I was just telling the dev team, this is actually a great opportunity for synergy. We can—" "Harrison," Cherish interrupted. Her voice was raspy from exhaustion. He paused, his smile faltering slightly. "Yeah?" Cherish reached into her tote bag. She pulled out a single sheet of paper. She hadn't gone to a lawyer for this. She had drafted it at 3 a.m. on her laptop, sitting on the floor of her empty new mansion, and printed it at a 24-hour FedEx Kinko's. "This is a formal termination of your contract," Cherish said, handing him the paper. It fluttered slightly in her trembling hand, but her gaze was dead level. "Effective immediately. Cause, gross restructuring." Harrison didn't take the paper. He stared at it as if it were coated in anthrax. You can't do that. My equity vests in 3 months. I have a contract with Dallas. Dallas doesn't own this company. Apex Holdings transferred all operational authority to me at 6 o'clock last night," Cherish said, stepping closer to him. She could smell the sour anxiety radiating off his expensive cologne. "You don't have equity, Harrison. You have a severance package. I suggest you go to your desk, pack your personal items, and leave your key card with the gentleman in the lobby." "You're making a mistake," Harrison sneered, the friendly facade crumbling into defensive malice. "You've been out of the loop for a year. You don't know the current architecture. The predictive models are completely different from your original build. You can't run this without me." Cherish finally smiled. It wasn't a happy expression. It was a baring of teeth. "Harrison," she said quietly, leaning in so only he could hear. "I wrote the kernel. I built the foundation. What you've done for the last year is slap a cheap coat of paint on a load-bearing wall. I don't need you to run my code. I just need you out of my way." She shoved the paper into his chest, forcing him to grab it so it wouldn't fall. She didn't wait for his response. She sidestepped him and walked straight past the executive office, heading for the heavy steel door at the back of the floor, the server room. She swiped the master key card Adam's man had given her. The light blinked green. The heavy door clicked open. She stepped inside. The temperature dropped 10 degrees instantly. The deafening rhythmic roar of the cooling fans hit her like a physical wave. Row upon row of black server racks blinked with thousands of tiny blue and green LED lights in the dim room. The smell was distinct: ozone, dust, and cold electricity. Cherish closed the door, cutting off the silence of the office floor. She was alone in the roar of the machines. She walked to the master terminal at the center of the room. She pulled out the heavy metal stool and sat down. Her fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard. The keys were cool to the touch. She closed her eyes for a second. The contradiction inside her was a heavy knot. She was only sitting here because a man who had abandoned her decided to flex his billions. Her victory was bought, paid for by the ghost of a father who thought he could purchase absolution. But as she opened her eyes and looked at the blinking command prompt on the screen, the guilt receded, pushed back by an overwhelming primal familiarity. Adam bought the building, but Cherish built the engine. She placed her hands on the keyboard. She typed in the command to access the root directory. Admin login. Password. Her fingers flew across the keys, bypassing the new, clunky security protocols Harrison had installed. Diving deep into the back-end backdoors she had coded into the system 3 years ago. Doors Dallas had never been smart enough to find. The screen cascaded with green text. Lines of code, her language, flooding the monitor. Access granted. Welcome, user. C_Young. Cherish let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension of the last 2 years finally bleeding out of her spine. She stared at the blinking cursor. She was home, and she had a lot of dead weight to delete. The purge took 72 hours. Cherish slept in her clothes on the small, synthetic leather sofa in the corner of the server room. The leather squeaked under her weight, sticking to her damp skin whenever the room's air conditioning cycled off. She subsisted entirely on black coffee that tasted like battery acid and protein bars from the break room vending machine. She didn't emerge until Thursday morning. When she finally pushed the heavy steel door open, the office outside was entirely transformed. The chaotic, buzzing energy of Dallas's tenure, the frantic ping-pong games, the loud, empty brainstorming sessions designed to look productive, was gone. The remaining staff, 52 engineers and developers Cherish had vetted and retained, were working in a tense, focused silence. Cherish walked past the glass partitions, her boots heavy on the low-pile carpet. She smelled like stale sweat and ozone. Her knuckles were bruised from accidentally slamming them into a server rack. She had never felt better. She paused at the desk of Toby. a junior developer who had always looked terrified whenever Dallas walked past. Toby was currently staring at a dual-monitor setup, frantically scrolling through a database migration log. "The patch on Sector 4 is unstable," Cherish said, her voice gravelly. Toby jumped, his knee violently striking the underside of his desk. A half-empty can of energy drink wobbled precariously. Ms. Young, sorry. Yes, I'm trying to rewrite the routing logic, but the legacy code Harrison left is a nightmare. It's held together by digital duct tape." "Stop trying to fix his duct tape," Cherish said. She reached over, ignoring her own smell, and tapped the top of his monitor. "Rip it out, start from the root, use the API library we built in 2023. It's cleaner." Toby blinked, staring at her unkempt hair and the dark, bruised circles under her eyes. He looked down at his keyboard, then back at her. "He deleted that library, Cherish. Harrison said it was obsolete." Cherish felt a dull ache behind her temples. Of course he had. "It's not deleted. It's archived in the cold storage server under a hidden partition. Directory path is C-H-alpha. Password is my birthday." Toby's fingers flew across his keyboard. A second later, a massive file directory populated his right screen. He exhaled a long, shaky breath. "Holy shit, it's all here. Rip out the rot, Toby. Take the weekend if you need it." She walked away, leaving him staring at the screen like a man who had just found water in a desert. That night, Cherish returned to the house on Mulholland Drive. The silence of the mansion was oppressive. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum where a murder had taken place. Dallas's scent, that sharp synthetic eucalyptus, still clung to the drywall and the curtains. She hated it. She ordered a cheap pepperoni pizza from a local joint down the hill. When the delivery driver handed over the greasy cardboard box, he stared openly at the massive frosted glass doors and the crushed white gravel, clearly wondering why the owner of a $10 million estate was tipping him with crumpled $1 bills. Cherish sat in the middle of the empty, cavernous living room. She didn't turn on the recessed lighting. She sat cross-legged on the $20,000 gray rug, eating lukewarm pizza directly from the box. The cheese was rubbery. The crust was burnt. It was the best thing she had tasted in a year. She looked around the dark room. She was rich. On paper, she possessed a net worth that most people couldn't comprehend. Yet, the victory felt jagged. She had her company back, but she was entirely alone in a house she despised, eating trash, tethered to the reality that her salvation had been purchased by the man who abandoned her mother to die in a cramped apartment. The contradiction churned in her stomach, mixing uneasily with the greasy pepperoni. Adam Howard hadn't saved her out of love. He had saved her because she was an asset, a reflection of his own intellect. He had seen a bad investment, Dallas, and liquidated him. Cherish wiped the grease from her fingers onto her dark jeans. She pulled her phone from her pocket. The screen was still cracked, spiderwebbing across the glass. She opened her contacts, staring at the number Adam's lawyer had emailed her yesterday. She tapped the screen. The phone rang 3 times. A heavy analog static hummed over the connection before a voice answered. Howard. Adam's voice was exactly the same over the phone as it was in person. Dense, authoritative, carrying the textural weight of a falling vault door. In the background, Cherish could hear the faint, rhythmic blast of a ship's horn echoing off the Chicago riverfront. I received the finalized transfer deeds from your legal team this afternoon, Cherish said. She didn't bother with a greeting. The time for social pleasantries had died a decade and a half ago. There was a brief pause on the line. The sound of a heavy sigh, or perhaps just Adam settling into a leather chair. Are the board members complying? They resigned, Cherish replied flatly. I offered them the choice between a quiet exit or a forensic audit of the corporate expense accounts they ran up with Dallas. They chose the door. Good, Adam grunted. Never leave a parasite attached if you can afford the surgery to remove it. Cherish leaned back, resting her palms on the cold, polished concrete floor. I'm restructuring the ownership. I'm splitting 15% of the equity into a blind trust for the engineering team. They stayed when Dallas stopped paying their overtime. They earned it. It's your company, Adam said, though there was a faint note of approval in his baritone. You don't need to report your cap table to me. I do, actually, Cherish said, her voice dropping to a hard, unyielding register. Because I am drafting a promissory note for $40 million plus an annual interest rate of 4.5%. The line went entirely silent. The distant ship's horn blew again, long and mournful. I told you, Adam finally said, his voice tightening. It wasn't a loan. It was a transfer. A gift. I don't want your gifts, Adam, Cherish said. She stared out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling, smog-choked grid of Los Angeles below. Millions of tiny, distant lights. My mother died scrubbing floors because she refused your money. She was too proud to survive. I'm not my mother. I will use the sword you handed me, but I won't be owned by it. And I won't be owned by you. The silence stretched again, thick and heavy. Cherish didn't fill it. She let the weight of her words hang in the digital ether. She could feel her pulse thumping in her wrist. I will pay you back, Cherish continued, her tone stripping away any remaining emotion, reducing the conversation to cold, hard calculus. Every cent. It will take me 5 years, maybe 7, but you will be a creditor, not a savior. We are going to put this on paper, legally. If you don't agree, I will sink Oculus into the ground, sell the patents to the Chinese, and wire you whatever the scrap metal is worth. She wasn't bluffing. The sheer, terrifying reality of her threat resonated through the phone line. She would burn the empire down before she let it become a gilded cage built by an absentee father. Adam exhaled. The sound was ragged, old. For the first time, the billionaire didn't sound like a titan of industry. He just sounded tired. You always were the most stubborn creature I ever met, Adam murmured. You have your mother's spine, but you have my brain. Don't flatter yourself, Cherish said. Do we have a deal? Have your new counsel draft the note, Adam conceded. Send it to my Chicago office by Friday. I'll sign it. Goodbye, Adam. Cherish. He spoke quickly, stopping her thumb before it hit the red icon. The house. Mercer's house. It's too big for you. It smells like a tomb. Sell it. Cherish looked around the dark, empty living room. The cold concrete. The oppressive glass. I plan to. I'm calling a realtor tomorrow. I prefer basements. Good, Adam said quietly. Keep your head down, kid. The line clicked dead. Cherish lowered the phone to her lap. She sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the hum of the central air and the distant wail of a siren miles below in the city. The nausea was finally gone. The anger was still there, a low, smoldering coal in her chest. But it was no longer consuming her. It was fuel. She picked up a slice of cold pizza, took a bite, and began to mentally draft the architecture for the new routing logic. She had work to do. If you felt the chill of that courtroom and the absolute satisfaction of Cherish's revenge, don't just scroll past. Hit that like button to support stories of raw, unapologetic comebacks. Share this with anyone who has ever been underestimated or pushed to the margins. Let them know the architect always wins in the end. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep, grounded audio drama. Drop a comment below. What would you have done to Dallas? See you in the next story.